Welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. In this week's episode, we're going to be continuing the same conversation from the last episode when we were talking about cognitive functions and compulsions. That is, the cognitive functions that we feel compelled to use depending upon our personality type. And in the last podcast, we discussed the judging functions, or the functions that help us make decisions in the world and evaluate criteria. And in this week, we'll be talking about our compulsion to use our preferred perceiving functions, the information gathering sort of lens in which we experience all of our sensory and intuitive information.
If you remember on the last episode, we talked about how if we have one of these functions in our car model or our function stack, we feel compelled to use them, maybe not always in the best way. We might be clumsy about it. We may not have the most sharpened tool around it, but yet there's still part of us that can't help but want to use this function, regardless of where it is in our stack or car model.
Right. So if a cognitive function, just to give a little bit of a recap of what we talked about in the last episode, but it is a two-parter. So if you didn't hear the first one, you might miss some context. You might want to go back and listen to that one last week. But just to give a little bit of a primer on what we discussed last week, we talked about this idea of a compulsion to use a function in our four-function stack, or what we here at Personality Hacker call the CAR model. We have a compulsion to use them because they are either our preferred functions for engaging with the world, or they are intrinsically linked to our preferred functions in a polarity. And so we get a reward for using them. Our preferred functions, the reason why they're our preference is because they're attached to reward centers in our mind. And when we use those functions, we get a hit. We get a reward for using those functions. And then each of these functions has a polarity opposite. So that polarity opposite function comes along for the ride. It is also a compulsion, but as Joel, you just mentioned, it can be clumsy, particularly if it's in the backseat of the car, or what's called the tertiary and inferior function. When you use something a lot, you end up getting a certain amount of proficiency in the use of that thing. Let's pretend it's a tool. And in this case, it's a cognitive function. So the more we use a cognitive function, the more reward we get for it, the more likely we're going to grab it as a tool in our toolbox, and the more proficiency we're going to have, and it's going to grow over time. So we talked a little bit about this concept of territory. The more we use a cognitive function, the more territory we take in while using that function or in relationship to that function. So we understand certain principles around it. We understand what rules can be broken when using it and which rules you're not supposed to break. We understand when the context is right to use that tool. Now, of course, if it's our dominant function, we have a tendency to overuse it and insist on using it in more context than maybe it's the appropriate, function to use. And at the same time, we get really good at kind of knowing how to shoehorn the situation to accept our function as a good tool for that. It doesn't always work, but we have a tendency to be decent at doing that, at sort of requiring the world to make space for us and our dominant function, since that's the one we're going to be showing up with the most. That said, when we do that, we then see the relationship between it and other things. And so we don't just shoehorn, but we actually become good at having the world accommodate this part of who we are because we're showing up well and using it. And most people will make space for competence. We also grow in our discretion. So discretion is knowing when and how much to apportion of something. And the more we use a function, the more we understand how components of it, the things that come along with using that function, how much and when we should be engaged with that element of that function. So just as an easy, example of this, when is it the right time? We talked about in the last podcast, when is it a good time to brag and how should one brag? Well, what is bragging? Bragging is increasing social credibility. When a person uses the judging function of, say, extroverted feeling or harmony, and they're trying to establish social credibility, if it's an inferior or 3-year-old function, it might turn into something that's rather crude, like just straight on bragging in a way that other people find maybe off-putting. But if a person has it as a dominant, then there are ways in which they understand are totally socially acceptable to sort of butter yourself up or talk a little bit about how good you are at something in a way that is very socially acceptable, and people will then give you the social credibility you're looking for because you understand discretion around this concept of increasing your credibility. So there are certain things that come along with each of these functions that when we're using them often enough, we understand how to navigate through the space using that function as a part of your tool set. And we talked a little bit about, not a little bit, we dedicated an entire podcast to the judging function. So now we're going to talk about that same principle of territory, of understanding when you can break rules and when you can't, of this idea of discretion, all around the perceiving function. So these would be the intuitive and sensing functions in both their introverted and extroverted attitudes.
So when I think about this, I look at what we talked about last week, and it seems to be pretty obvious because these are things even at the 3-year-old or inferior position in your car model or your stack, you are making decisions about things. You are judging something. You're making criteria. You're taking criteria and applying judgment to that criteria to say, I'm going to act in this way or I'm going to behave in this way. I make this decision, basically. As we talk about the perceiving functions, these are the ways we view the world. And so this is a little bit of a difference here between what we talked about last week in the judging elements of things and what you see in the world. So as these functions sit in the back seat at the tertiary 10-year-old level or at the inferior or 3-year-old level, these are going to inform the way you perceive your life, perceive your world, what territory you take in. So it's less about evaluation. It's more about the territory or not territory is a bad word because we used that last week around the functions themselves, like how much territory they take in. Let me say it a different way. It's how much of the world you see this way. So just as an example from my personal life, introverted sensing, we've nicknamed it memory, is my 3-year-old process. It's the baby part of me in the car model or in my cognitive function stack. And it's very unsophisticated in how it sees the world. I don't have a lot of sophistication when I'm pulling upon that function in my life of what I can see. It's almost like driving. How I almost look at it is the further down this perceiving function is in your stack, it's the fog in front of the headlights at nighttime as you're driving. I can't see very far with it. I only can see maybe 10 feet in front of me. There's fog. It's a dark road, metaphorically speaking. My headlights can't see down the road. Whereas my primary function, which is extroverted intuition or exploration, it's perceptively for me, metaphorically, like I'm on a bright sunny day and I can see clear into the horizon, 50, 60 miles away. So this is kind of how I think of it in my life. It's almost like how far out can I see or perceive, metaphorically speaking, with this function? The lower it is on the stack, the more fog, the more unclear it is, the more I just don't know what I'm looking at here. I can only see something very, very short term in front of me.
Yeah, that's the challenge with perceiving functions. Like when it comes to judging functions, we call them evaluative or decision making, and that's much closer to the root of what the judging functions do than how we have tried to make perceiving functions accessible. We call them information gathering or learning or attention getting, and even that's not quite right. Really, the word perceptive or perception is easily the best word. It's just sometimes hard to wrap your head around. So we know that when we talk about them as information gathering, we're being inaccurate when we say that. And yet that's the closest thing to the idea of simply what captures your attention. Where does your neck turn so that your eyes can be pointed at something? That's the purest form of a perceiving function. How are you attempting to take information in? And so the perceiving functions can be in some ways a little more difficult to grasp because they're more neutral. There's a neutrality to them. There's sort of an acceptance element, and that this is just how I engage with the world. This is just what I look at. And so I think sometimes we start with the judging functions because they're a little easier to wrap your head around. And yet when it comes to the perceiving functions, we still feel compulsions to experience them too. And so, and particularly those of us who are intuitive, because I know that we have a very high percentage of our audience is intuitive. Those of you who are intuitive, sometimes it's hard for us to understand the compulsion we have for our sensing processes or sensing functions, and yet we have them. I think sensors, particularly in the modern world, requires so much pattern recognition from us because it's changing so quickly, and that's unprecedented in human history, is how quickly we have to adapt to the new world. I think sensors are becoming more aware of their relationship with their intuitive functions, even if they don't have this language. They understand the challenges they experience when things move so quickly on them, and how they have to integrate that part of who they are and their particular compulsion or the ways that it shows up for them. But for those of us who are intuitive, it's almost like we resist the sensory part of us, particularly if we feel like it's been pushed down our throats in some ways. And so I think it's really good to understand our relationship with these compulsions and understand how the sensing part of us as intuitives knocks on our door or taps us on the shoulder or whispers into our ears. So then we can have a much healthier relationship with these compulsions and integrate them as opposed to trying to resist them. Okay, so just as a reminder for how polarities work, there are two sets of perceiving polarities, and that is the relationship that these four functions have with each other. And if you are familiar with the technical terms, introverted sensing, or what we call memory, is intrinsically linked to extroverted intuition, or what we call exploration. They make up a single polarity. So all NPs and SJs are using this polarity. All NPs and SJs will have a compulsion in some way to use the functions of extroverted intuition or exploration and introverted sensing or memory. Whereas the other polarity of introverted intuition, or what we call perspectives, and extroverted sensing, or what we call sensation, that also makes up a polarity. And those are used by NJs and SPs. So all NJ types and all SP types will, on some level, have a compulsion to use introverted intuition or perspectives and extroverted sensing or sensation. And it doesn't matter where it falls in the car, right? Because you're highly compelled to use whichever side of that polarity is your dominant or auxiliary, or what we call the driver co-pilot. You will feel highly compelled and get a lot of rewards for using that function. So the other side of the polarity comes along for the ride, right? It's basically because no polarity exists in a silo. You have to have both sides of them. It's like a comet with a tail. So if you are compelled as an NJ type, say, to use introverted intuition or perspectives, then you are also compelled to use extroverted sensing or sensation. It's just, again, because it falls further down in your stack or is in the backseat of your car, you're going to have a lot less proficiency there. You're going to take in a lot less territory. You are not going to have the same amount of discretion. And so because you will be indiscreet with this function, it will show up in all sorts of weird ways that you have to sort of make peace with and contend with as maybe your blind spot or however you choose to see it.
I almost think of the functions in the backseat of the car like fishing lures. You're a fish in the water and you're swimming along doing your thing, and all of a sudden you see this shiny object. You're like, oh, what's that over there? Or whatever. You know, it's like this thing that captures your attention, even if it's your 3-year-old or your inferior process. It captures your attention in some ways. And it's weird to me how things that aren't in my car or in my cognitive function stack, they just don't capture my attention. I'm always fascinated by seeing like an INJ, for example, captured by things that are extroverted sensing. That part of them that's their 3-year-old or inferior, I don't even notice that stuff. And they notice it. And I'm like, but that's not you at all, but it is them. Like, that's the thing you have to think in terms of, this is so much a part of our personality. It's weird how it comes out, like you're talking about.
Yeah, so let's just start with extroverted sensing or sensation and how it ends up being a compulsion for some types to use, even if it's the inferior function. So extroverted sensing is in some ways, it's a desire to merge oneself with their experience. It's a desire to be non-dualistic, right? There's no difference between you, your body, yourself, and everything you're experiencing outside of yourself. And so there becomes high proficiency when people use extroverted sensing or sensation as like a dominant driver or co-pilot auxiliary, all the SPs, because there is a compulsion to merge with the environment. There becomes really high levels of proficiency of kinesthetic movement, right? Like the ability to move through the world, having a direct relationship with all of the things that the senses are taking in real time. And this ends up manifesting as a really sometimes delightful and sometimes scary sense of being in the world, like a lack of fear, a lack of giving yourself any limitations when it comes to your physical movement or your autonomy. It's a movement through the world of going, well, there's no difference between me and all of the colors I'm experiencing and all the shapes I'm looking at and all the flavors I'm tasting and the smells I'm smelling, and there's no real difference between me and this tool that I'm touching. It's just an extension of my body. And so because there's this sense of experience that extroverted sensing has, no matter where it falls in the car, there's going to be a compulsion to basically, quote unquote, shut off implication, shut off the mind, shut off what it all means, and simply be with it. Now, extroverted sensing's opposite of introverted intuition or perspectives is all about meaning making and implication, which is why you can't have one without the other, because there is a part where you've experienced enough and merged enough with the environment that your brain automatically goes, but what is the meaning of all of it, right? What does it all mean? And there's going to be a moment when you're so lost in your meaning making that you need to go back out and engage with the world to remember what you're even attempting to make meaning around. And so these two pieces, these two parts of this polarity informs the other, that there's just a moment when it doesn't matter how much you're trying to push it away, it tells you to go seek the other side. For extroverted sensing, I mean, you can see how it's a compulsion in people who are SPs in all sorts of ways. And a big piece of that is adrenaline, right? Because if you are compelled to go merge with the environment and the environment is exciting, has a lot of great stuff going on with it, then there's that feeling of needing to push it a little further, particularly if there's not a lot of fear associated with it. The fear part for SPs, even if it's a dominant function for them or a driver function, the fear part usually comes when that introverted intuition or perspective stops to pop up, right? It's like, what is the implication of this behavior? What's the end of the line for this thing? Like, where is this headed? And that's future pacing. It's future pacing their behaviors. But without it, there's the compulsion to simply be in that moment, to be with whatever is happening. When we see it as an inferior function or a 3-year-old for INJs, that compulsion is that piece where they can no longer neglect their body. They can no longer see their body as simply a vehicle for their brain. When they check in with it and go, oh, there's symptoms here. Like, there's things happening inside of me that I just want to be with. I don't want to be in my mind. I want to be in my body now. I want to be in the environment. I want to see a non-dualistic perspective where it's not just me taking a meta perspective of everything that's going on and feeling a little divorced from life, which is what introverted intuition or perspectives encourages people to do, but not to be divorced, but rather to be the moment, to be in that moment, not be in that moment simply, but like I just said, be the moment. And so you'll see this with some INJs even having a little bit of an adrenaline junkie piece to them, where they either hate roller coasters because it's so overwhelming to them, or they love roller coasters and they're the kind of people who go visit roller coasters all the time to get the biggest and the baddest, or they'll drive a little too fast. Or if they're a more gentle style, maybe they have issues around being highly sensitive and adrenaline just spooks them out, then you'll see this in getting really interested in health and nutrition, or really getting into things like yoga or maybe even tantra. It's a desire to be at one with the body and to honor the body. And so that compulsion shows up regardless of whether or not they're, it's a dominant or auxiliary or an inferior. That said, oftentimes, well, that's what it looks like if the person has it integrated, right? If they understand this part of who they are and they've contended with it, made peace with it, and they're looking for healthy outlets. If they haven't, and it's something that's simply whispering in their ear, and they haven't really contended with what it does to them, there's this sense that they aren't at all controlled by their body. They are just a mind, and their body is the vehicle for their brain. And so when it shows up, it is incredibly overwhelming oftentimes. And this is what looks like deep sensory indulgence. This is eating too much, or it's, maybe a form of sloth, sitting around and just wanting to be physically comfortable. It can also go the other direction of being too, they work out, or the person who's using extrovert sensing as an inferior might work out too much. But then when there's an opportunity, like it's almost like it's that lack of discretion. It's like how much is too much and how much is not enough. If a person who has extroverted sensing as an inferior 3-year-old starts to drink, sometimes that really shows up and evidences as a problem, or having issues with, substances.
I think you're right about the obvious issue potentially with substances or indulgences, as an example of extroverted sensing in the backseat at the 10-year-old or at the 3-year-old, tertiary or inferior position of your cognitive functions. And I think the other thing here, remember, this is about nuance and the ability to read a high fidelity of the picture of what's happening. I know an INTJ who, when he drinks too much, he doesn't register that. So it's not that he's always indulging all the time. He doesn't drink that often. But when he drinks, he doesn't know how much he's had. It's almost like he doesn't register his inebriation state. So if he's really buzzed, he doesn't register it. I'm fine. Nothing's wrong. And I think he's being honest. I don't think he's trying to pass off inebriation as not a big deal. I actually don't believe he's registering it as well, because extroverted sensing, when it's at the 3-year-old or inferior position for an INTJ, they may not have as much fidelity in tapping into what's going on for their body as much. He's not as aware of his own body state. And so I think that's the other way it can show up, all these perceiving functions, but particularly extroverted sensing. I think you just don't have a sense of where you're at physically. You might be hurt and not register it, or you may over-register it. The registration or the measurement, the feedback loop is very low, and you don't have a lot of fidelity around that feedback loop.
Right. That's part of the phenomenon of not taking in as much territory, of not having the discretion around it. And I think that while that is how extroverted sensing or sensation inferior 3-year-old manifests, I think what's interesting is understanding the compulsion to be there anyway, or to have those parts in there anyway. The feeling of inebriation, there might be something to what you're talking about, which is that you don't really experience it as directly as maybe somebody else would, because you're not used to feeling your body. You're not used to checking in with your body as much. And yet there's still the delightful sensation of being inebriated, because it takes you out of your body. Takes you out of your mind and into your body. You want to be in that place. That's probably why there is so much compulsion around overindulgence, is that it's almost like somebody who has a harder time of being anesthetized, right? Because my brother and my father both famously talk about how it's almost impossible to get them under anesthetic. My dad woke up one time in the middle of surgery because it's so difficult to put him under. And yet, if a person wants to be in their body, and yet it takes so much for them to get there to even register it, then the idea of more, right, piling on more would be how you get there. In order to anesthetize my brother and my father, you have to give them more anesthetic, right? And so in order for the INJ to obey the compulsion to be in their body, they have to amp it up a little bit more, which is why oftentimes it turns into overindulgence.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many NJs that I've talked to. A lot of them are into stuff like BDSM, right? Because it's a physical, it's a super heightened visceral experience. And I'm surprised. At first I was surprised. Now I'm noticing it's a pattern. I'm not surprised anymore. But at first I was like, really? And I talked to multiple NJs that a lot of them are into this. And I'm like, wow, I would have never expected. But now that I know type, of course that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and not that every NJ is going to be into that. I don't think that's what you're saying. But
No.
I just, for the one person out there who's like, hey, I'm an NJ and I'm not into that. We're not talking about you. We're just saying that there's a pattern here of having to amp things up in order to really feel them. Now, what's interesting is that on the other side of the coin, when extroverted sensing or sensation is a dominant or a driver, you're going to see some of the same stuff. And the reason why is because they're there so often, they've inured themselves to some of those experiences. So you're also going to see an amp up in the dominant driver position, which is kind of fascinating. I think there's more of a fearlessness around physicality the further up it goes in the stack. When I meet ISPs who are really afraid for their physical body, I know immediately they are way too much in their tertiary 10-year-old position, because the fear of physical, the fearing physical safety or endangerment by, doing actions or activities is something introverted intuition or perspectives is, that's the function that has a little bit of hesitancy, because it knows that it doesn't have proficiency in that place. That's not its sandbox. And so when I meet an ISP who's like, yeah, I have a lot of fears, I'm like, well, then you need to get into your auxiliary, because extroverted sensing or sensation is the fearlessness around physical risks. And so, there's that part. There's everybody who has extroverted sensing or sensation in their stack on some level just wants to be a daredevil. They just like it. And how much they're going to give themselves permission around that is depending upon where it falls. But even if it's an inferior, and it doesn't have to be necessarily, actually, it's not, man, daredevil's the wrong word.
No, well, it's fascination. During our profiler training group, we show clips of daredevil activities, skydiving, these skateboarders are going down mountainsides really fast. All the INJs are like, wow, this is so fascinating. Like they just are fascinated by it. Doesn't mean they'll necessarily do it themselves, right?
Yeah, that's when I think that there's always this sense of fascination around people who can do that. I think the word I wasn't looking for was adrenaline or risk taking. I think the word I'm looking for is goosebumps. Like experiences that give your body a visceral response. Yeah. It's almost like the word goosebumps is the closest I can think of to it. And so I've also noticed that a lot of NJs are into ASMR. I'm saying it correctly, ASMR, which is YouTube videos and podcasts and anything that gives your body almost a sense of goosebumps when you hear it. And so people will talk like this with a lot of syllable S's, and there's this sense of whispering and like sounds like, just like these almost... They're the opposite of erotic. They are not erotic sounds, and yet they will give you goosebumps. I'm sure I didn't with my shitty ASMR that I just did, but it's like I'm trying to express. Like if you run into a video and somebody's whispering, that's probably what's going on. And so I think no matter where it falls in the stack, extroverted sensing wants goosebumps. And so even if it's not a dominant or auxiliary, even if it's a tertiary or inferior, there's going to be a sense of seeking out things that just kind of makes it shiver a little bit. And I think that's because it forces you out of your head and it forces you into the moment. You are now fully merged with whatever's happening, right? If you are getting an immediate visceral response to somebody whispering and it's giving you goosebumps, it's almost like you're merged with that thing. It's almost like extroverted sensing sort of makes love with the rest of the world all the time because it's constantly merging. And I believe that is the compulsion. Then on the flip side is introverted intuition or perspectives. It's the opposite of it in its polarity. And that would be the compulsion to actually be separated from the visceral world. It's a removal. It's a sense of taking a third-person perspective on literally everything, including oneself. So introverted intuition's compulsion, no matter where it falls, is to live in a realm of imagination. Because it is by definition not reality. It's by definition not merged with the outside world. It is entirely dualistic. It's entirely separated from what's going on everywhere else, including your own brain, because it's attempting to take a meta perspective on everything. So if you're 1 degree of separation from everything, then literally the sky's the limit. You can imagine anything you want to. Any fantastical anything can be imagined. And you're looking for patterns to indicate that this thing that you've imagined there might be something to this in this pattern. Even if it's not something that you will ever experience in the quote unquote real world, it's something that might be pointing to something you might experience in the real world. Like I think of, fantasy stories, the orcs, elves, etc. do not exist in reality. And yet having an entire storyline based around some of these characters might tell us something about ourselves. So there's value in the imagination. There's value in just living 100% inside your own brain and just thinking grandiose thoughts and allowing it to sort of unfold in front of you as you're experiencing it internally. And no matter who you are, you're going to have a compulsion. If you're an NJ or an SP, no matter who you are, if it is in your 4-function stack or your car model, you're going to feel a compulsion to try to figure those things out. And a big piece of understanding the pattern is getting inside other people's heads, trying to figure out what is meaningful and has implication for them as well. Because the patterns aren't just found in oneself, it's shared patterns. It's the patterns that we're not necessarily sharing in real time, that would be extroverted intuition, but the patterns that are the patterns of all people. And being able to observe those. What are the predictable patterns inside of humans? And, forecasting where those predictable patterns are going to go. How do they unfold? We know they're predictable they're patterns because we can predict them. And we know where they're eventually going to end up. So it ends up becoming a divorcing oneself of reality in order to be able to see reality from a distance and and make those predictions and to observe the things that have implications and meaning in the world.
The book of Revelation in the Bible, it's the last book of the Bible, and it's extremely abstract. It's got all this metaphor and all this abstraction, all this meaning making and patterns and numbers. And it's just a very interesting, I would consider it a very intuitive styled book with a lot of stuff. And you've seen movies and popular media using that book as a basis for their storytelling. And I've noticed that both my ESFP brother and my INFJ mother love the book of Revelation and all of the metaphor around it, all the storytelling, all the nuance there. And I was always, even before I knew type, I was always fascinated by how my brother and mother, and you don't have to know type to see their very different personalities, were both interested in this as I was growing up. I would watch this and I was like, that's really interesting. Like, how could two people so different from each other like a similar thing, and maybe for different reasons, but there was almost a compulsion from my brother, even though he's introverted intuition, inferior 3-year-old, to tap into this, and he calls it his favorite book of the Bible, this like metaphoric, abstract book of the Bible. It was a place for him to have his imagination, intuition play. And my mother, who is intuitive primary, she also loved it. It was one of her favorite books as well. And so I just thought that was really interesting how that compulsion shows up for two different personalities toward the same thing even. It's not even that they're just interested in introverted intuition things to, separately different topics, which they are, but even the same topic fascinated both of them, which I thought was really, really interesting to study and watch.
Well, I think with a lot of people who are, of the Judeo-Christian religions, well, I mean, if you're talking about the book of Revelation, you're talking about Christian religions because that's part of the Greek scriptures. And so the people who are in Christian religions and use introverted intuition, that's very common for them because Revelation there are other books of the Bible that also have a lot of prediction and metaphor and that sort of thing, like Ezekiel, Isaiah, etc. But that's the one that caps off the Greek scriptures, which is the Greek scriptures are always more fun for everybody to read than the Hebrew scriptures, or New Testament is more fun than the Old Testament to read for the most part. And so that ends up being a book that's very fascinating and it gets filleted out like crazy. I was thinking on a secular side of this, or like a more of a secular example. I remember I worked one time with an ESFP who was like super into Lord of the Rings. And this was years and years and years ago. And so the books, the movies had come out and he and I would geek out about them. And I liked Lord of the Rings almost more because I'd grown up with the stories, because my two NJ, like my mother and my brother, who are both NJs, loved the books. And so I grew up reading them with them, but I almost had more of a loyalty to it. Not to say that I didn't love the imagination of it, but it was more like I was loyal to it, probably because my introverted sensing or memory was attached to it. But he just loved it for its own sake, and I remember finding that so fascinating. This was actually before I knew cognitive functions, and I couldn't figure out why this ESFP, who hated reading for most other things, loved Lord of the Rings and would read them over and over again. And I think you see this too. And I think I one of the challenges, we're talking about in profile training, one of the challenges is that an SP will be into a bunch of stuff that looks like intuitive stuff. And that might throw you off in a profiling session, because I know a lot of ESPs in particular that are massively into stuff like, horoscopes, or they're into maybe not even horoscopes. That might be too little for them. They might really be into astrology, or they might be into numerology, or they might be into like all this stuff that feels very imaginative. They'll be into tarot and palm reading, and that will all feel very intuitive. And yet that's their 3-year-old or inferior function, or 10-year-old or tertiary function coming out to play. That's that part of them that goes, yeah, maybe there is something bigger than everything we know, and we can't directly experience everything. Maybe there's a part that, like they kind of hand themselves over to this part of them that lives in the realm of imagination. Not saying that any of that stuff is or isn't true, but it is the imagination part of us. It's the part that we cannot prove is not, may or may not be real. And yet they'll have all of this, interest and fascination with, and a real compelled, a real feeling of compulsion around wanting to sort of saturate in that world. So I think for people who are SPs, this idea of introverted intuition is a compulsion for them, and it shows up in almost how they experience spirituality oftentimes. Not to say that the dude who was reading Lord of the Rings was experiencing it and as a sense of spirituality, but he very well could have been. I mean, that's not uncommon for people to take popular fiction and spiritualize it in some ways. And then when you see it going up the stack and higher up in the car model, you'll see that it's not just quote unquote playing around with imagination, but it gets real serious, right? Like as in, no, I'm pretty sure that this is what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Or I'm fairly certain this is what's going on with another person. Or the ability to sort of read another person's energy without even directly experiencing them, like looking at them and just knowing what's happening for them. And so it gets more and more sophisticated, the territory gets bigger, and the discretion also becomes more sophisticated, in the sense that there are still people who use introverted intuition or perspectives as a dominant or driver that are into astrology and numerology and that sort of thing as well. But there's also this sense of when can they lean on it and trust it, and when shouldn't they? So we have an INFJ friend who gives us a tarot reading every year for our birthday. And it's kind of interesting, and sometimes I'm not sure if it's BS, and other times I'm like, wow, that was surprisingly accurate. But I personally feel like it's mostly just a way to pull out our intuition, like the things that are already in our head. We're sort of looking for avenues and on-ramps to pull our intuition out. That's how my extroverted intuition rationalizes all of it. But I think with our friend who's into it enough to give it as a birthday gift and to do regular tarot readings, she's actually pretty sophisticated in knowing when it's simply not the right tool for the job. She's more than willing to ignore it when it's not, like when it's like, well, that just wasn't appropriate for that context. It's just not the right thing. Like it's more her trying to pull her intuition out. Whereas I've noticed that people who are into tarot readings, when it's their introverted intuition is their inferior or tertiary, I've noticed that they have more of a sense that they're going to believe it. Like they hand a little bit more of their power over to it because they don't understand how it works or operates, not really. And so there's a sense of over-relying on that information. And then you can see that there are times when people completely divorce themselves from that because they buy into it so much. Because there's a sense that it must be believed and obeyed if you're going to, say, do a tarot reading or read an astrological chart or whatever. And then there's this sense that there's no autonomy. There's no, personal direction in the world, because then this thing has already predicted the fate of it. And then that gets them paranoid. And so they'll completely separate themselves, and that will become too much. And so again, it's a compulsion to use it, but then not knowing, not having as much of a discrete relationship with it, not knowing when the rules can be broken, not knowing how much to rely on it and when not to rely on it. And so that's oftentimes why people end up sometimes making as much distance or putting as much distance between themselves and their inferior function as they can.
So let's move over to the other polarity, introverted sensing, extroverted intuition. Let's start with introverted sensing, which is my 3-year-old. Inferior process. So you know how I feel about it. But it is still a compulsion for me. And if you have this in the backseat of your car or lower on your stack, it's going to be a compulsion for you. You're going to be feeling like it's something that you want to express or touch point or have part of your life, right? I think one of the things this really shows up for people in the back seat, introverted sensing, on a really high level, is this fascination with infrastructure and how things have been set up and the etymology of things. And one of the things that's really captured my attention has been historical records, historical things. We live here in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and there was a very significant battle during the American Civil War in 1863 that happened here, and it captures my fascination. I'm very interested in the dynamics that we're playing here historically, and I am interested to take people onto the battlefield to show them how that battle developed and how it turned the tide of the war to the world we live in now, which is much more free and much more open than it was at the time in 1863. And I just love seeing how things over time, I have this compulsion almost to look at things. I also have this compulsion, I think people in the backseat have this compulsion almost to record keep or preserve things just compulsively without even knowing why they're doing it. I tend to want to capture a lot of things. I'm using my own self as an example here, but I think this is something you probably resonate with if this is in the backseat of your car, is you just almost feel like you want to just capture the moments, capture things, even if you have no idea how you're going to use it in the future. Photographs, journal prompts, things that happened. It's important for some reason for the historical record to be captured and written down or recorded in some way. And I think these are two ways that I think this shows up for people on a really high level. And I'm sure you're listening, you might have a very unique expression of this that shows up for you if you have this in the backseat of your car. But ultimately, I think it's that record keeping and that fascination with etymology and infrastructure.
Yeah, and this idea of through lines and repetition and routine and having a ballast. Like you and I mean, we're two EPs. The fact that we've been able to do this podcast for 6 years, right? Are we at 6 years? Almost?
Somewhere around there.
All right. Ridiculous. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. That
Every week without fail.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we have to, I mean, you don't know this necessarily because you're listening to these podcasts whenever you're listening to them. But sometimes we've had to backdate them or whatever. We've been late. But we have faithfully done this every week for years. And I think one of the reasons why we do this is because we're trying to record our thoughts. Like this is as much for us as it is for anybody else. It has to be. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done it for this long. But this is us trying to like make a record of the things that we thought were really interesting to us at the time. And if we don't get them out in some way, we know that they'll die with us. And so this podcast is one of our introverted sensing or memory compulsions, is to get this out and recorded and set somewhere. Like it lives now. It lives outside of us. It lives in some place that it can be seen as part of a timeline. And we can go back and listen and hear our progression. We can hear our improvements. We can hear our thoughts changed a little bit and what was going on for us. I mean, I would say that this year I've been a lot less feisty than last year, right? And I only know that because I go back and listen to our podcast last year and I'm like, man, I was in a fighting mood. Just wanted to fight everybody. And, I mean, you might not be able to hear it, you as the listener, because it's a subtle thing, but maybe you can. Maybe you can hear the fact that I was like feisty about the challenges of the world and trying not to let that stuff creep into discussions about personality type and personal growth. And this year I'm way more chill. I'm just like, yeah, it's whatever it is. And it's just all going to be whatever it is. And I can hear that. I can hear that through, like in the beginning podcast, it's almost a little cringy to hear us be so formal and now we kick on the microphone and sometimes we get a little rambly, like probably with this podcast, we're a little rambly because, we've got our notes in front of us, but we're in kind of that mood, that rambly mood. So, but it's the point of all of that is that it's recorded. It lives somewhere and we can hear and watch those changes. I think for introverted sensing, no matter where it is in your stack, if it's in your 4-function stack, your car model, you have that compulsion to record, to keep for future generations, to have a precedent set, to have a timeline and through line. And I think you're absolutely right. I think another compulsion that comes along with it is the idea of templates and what has already come before. It's really important for introverted sensing. This is one of the reasons why it relies on experts, by the way, is that it needs to know what has worked in the past, what is the precedent, and then that's the only way for extroverted intuition or exploration to have innovation, because it has to know what came before in order to innovate into the future. And we didn't mention that. Did we mention this? Yeah, we mentioned it, that these are NPs and SJs. So NPs would be using it as their 10-year-old tertiary, introverted sensing or memory, would be using it as their 10-year-old or tertiary or 3-year-old inferior. And SJs would be using it as their dominant driver or co-pilot auxiliary. The higher up it gets in the stack, the more the person is going to have their finger on the pulse of those timelines, the more they're going to be actively tracking differences, actively tracking etymology, knowing how things were and the changes between how things were and now. They really have a direct connection to the idea of the passage of time. And so because of that, there's a sense of how they've changed as well. And that's another compulsion that comes along with introverted sensing is, who am I now compared to who I was before? There's a phenomenon that happens with introverted sensing that you'll see when it's in SJs, less so in NPs, but definitely more so in SJs, where reviewing what they have experienced is where they get their extroverted intuition or exploration ahas. They have the ability to do real-time pattern recognition in quotation marks. My fingers are doing those little quotation marks. Real-time pattern recognition, but they do it in the comfort of their own home by doing it in post, by having captured those experiences, go back reviewing them, and then they get their intuition from it, which of course is how we'll talk about the intuition compulsion that SJs experience as well. But the only way to have those moments of ahas and understanding of how things were and what things meant is through the recording process. So that recording process and understanding what was really going on there, what were the things that I maybe missed the first time, who was I at that time and who am I now, and how do I experience who I was in the past, that is really strong for people who have it as a dominant and as an auxiliary. That is the compulsion of introverted sensing or memory for those types. And those of us who are NPs who have it as a tertiary and inferior or 10-year-old, 3-year-old, we also do some of that. It's just we got most of those quote unquote real-time patterns in real time. We got them at the moment that we experienced them. So we tend to capture less. But when we do capture, that's part of what's happening is we're going back into the capture mechanism and experiencing an earlier incarnation of who we are versus who we are now. And that passage of time is super fascinating to us because that is our etymology. So like you were saying, Joel, etymology is the compulsion no matter where it fits in the stack. That said, there's also a sense of comfort seeking, and there's a sense of wanting things to feel like home. So there's a stuckness that can come along with introverted sensing or memory. There's a stuckness to what was and not wanting to see the passage of time as having involved any change, but focusing on the passage of time and focusing on what didn't change, what has stayed the same, and preserving something from the past and bringing it into the future. And for people who have it as a dominant auxiliary, those SJs, or you who may be an SJ, for those of you who use this is how you pass along tradition. And you know when something should or should not be passed along. There's a higher sense of discretion there. Is this creating positive experiences for people? Well, then this is one that should be continued on. We should preserve this one and conserve this one. And if it's not a good one, well, maybe we should cycle this one out. Whereas if we have it, those of us who are NPs and those of us who use it as a tertiary and inferior, we don't always have discretion around which things should be vetted out, like which of these feelings of like bringing the past into the future or into the present. Sometimes we're really bad at that. And so we end up bringing stuff into the present just because it's stuck with us, not because it's a good one, not because it's something that we want to keep preserving or passing along or whatever, but just because it's hanging around in our memory and we don't know how to get rid of it. And so we'll bring bad stuff into the present or in the future because that was cloying to us. And we don't have the discretion to just go, no, I think I'm going to remove this one or just not keep continuing this one on. We're like, oh shit, now I'm all stuck in this feeling or I'm stuck in this experience or, oh God, I'm fated to do this forever. And then we start to feel like we don't have any options.
I think this also shows up for people that have this as a inferior 10-year-old, introverted sensing, they want to have this be outside of themselves as something they can always rely upon because we want to change so much. We are changing and adapting quickly. That extroverted intuition part of us wants to see the new constantly. We still want to have that comfort seeking, someplace to rest. So this might show up in if your parents sell your childhood home after knowing, like, let's say I grew up in the same house from like the time I was like 12 or something until I was well into my 30s, and my parents moved, and that was really distressing for me because there was this stability in my life. I didn't have to engage with it. I didn't have to, it wasn't a house I managed. It was just in the back of my head. Like if I ever needed to go quote unquote home, I could go home anytime I wanted and have all that introverted sensing memory right there at the home I grew up in. Mostly in my most formative years. And it was a comfort to me. And it felt like that was always there and reliable. And then when they moved, that was distressing. It was like, no, you can't do that. Like I need that. That's a place I can go and land if I need it. I didn't want to have any responsibility to it, but I wanted it to exist and I wanted to carry on into the future. I think in terms of going down to Walt Disney World, to Epcot Center, when I was a little kid, I went there and it was a very scientific based place. There weren't a lot of roller coasters or childhood rides with characters. It was mostly about culture and science. And it formed an impression in my introverted sensing. And over the last few years, the Walt Disney Company's been changing the rides to put more characters in. They've gotten rid of the science stuff. They're putting in roller coasters now. It's much more, instead of intuitive and science-based, it's more just thrill ride stuff. And it's really bothering me because I want that place to exist outside of me that I can always return to anytime I want to have those comfort feelings of something that feels stable to my past. And when they change, you'd think I was an SJ because I'm like, wait, you can't change this on me. It's that compulsion to have something that's stable in your life. And I think that's where this shows up for us in the back seat.
I feel exactly the same way. And I think, well, let's flop over to extroverted intuition or exploration.
Sure.
Right? Which is our dominant driver. And I think there's a sense that when the reason why you want to innovate and make things better is because you want to have a better way of experiencing life. You want something, you don't want just innovation for innovation's sake necessarily when you're using it well. You want something that like really does improve things in the world. And once you found that, then why mess with it, right? And that's if we're using extroverted intuition or exploration as a dominant or auxiliary. We have a compulsion to change things for the better, to test, iterate, make things new, have a sense of novelty, primarily for the purposes of, we feel compelled to do it no matter what, but we are really trying to find the best way to do something. And there's a sense of throwing spaghetti against the wall because you'll never, like the best way to do something is oftentimes stumbled upon. It's not necessarily pre-thought out. And so there's a compulsion to change. But once that happens, that introverted sensing part of who we are goes, okay, that's the new norm now. And there's no reason to change it. And there's something very sad about it changing. So that said, extroverted intuition or exploration, when it is in a position of innovation, and I think innovation might be a better way of understanding that, but it is no matter where it falls in the stack, it is a compulsion towards novelty. So innovation is extroverted intuition or exploration at its best. That's what it does the best. But the compulsion is really something new, something that hasn't been seen before, a pattern that hasn't been experienced before, and making those connections. And so if the compulsion is towards novelty, once it gets detethered from the concept of innovation and making things better, once it's detethered from that, then the compulsion can just be around consumerism. It can be just around collecting things that are new or novel. So you can see that in particular when it's an a tertiary or 10-year-old function for ESJs. It's often, they'll make themselves feel better sometimes by going and buying something, right? Something that they didn't own before. And just the purchase of having something new will brighten their mood because it fed that part of who they are. I think as an inferior, though, for ISJs, you wouldn't think that they would have a sense of novelty, but there is a yearning. And I think it's a challenge in the world, not in the very most modern world. In the very most modern world, we're seeing a difference here. Like there's a big difference between how the world experiences SJs and how SJs experience the world in the last 20 years than pretty much all time periods previously. Even in the 20th century, where you had just innovation after innovation after innovation that changed people's lives with like electricity and then the radio and then the telephone and then TV and all that stuff, there was a lot of innovation that happened. But for the most part, it was like still manageable chunks. In the last 20 years, technology has changed to a place where it's impossible to keep up with it. Impossible no matter what type. So SJs now have to tap more into that extroverted intuition inferior function and be more open to rapid change. And so I don't think SJs are experiencing themselves as much in a sense of sort of staidness like they did all previous generations. But in times past, what would happen is that part of them, that yearning for adventure and novelty and something new and exciting, that part would be kind of stamped down by culture. Culture would tell them and reinforce the introverted sensing or memory part that told them to stick with what was known, get a good job, make sure that you've got enough resource, make sure that you're being a good family person and you're setting up your family. And so that part would kind of get moved away. But whenever I think of SJs, particularly ISJs, that have that sense of the extroverted intuition, 3-year-old or inferior sense of adventure and something new, is I think of the Pixar movie Up. I'm fairly certain that the main character, and I don't think that this is too radical for me to say on a podcast because I try to stay away from doing typing in characters and celebrity types and that sort of thing because I don't like the ensuing arguments. But I'm fairly certain that the main character, the elderly man in Up, was an ISTJ. And I suspect that his wife in the beginning montage was an ENFP. And I think it was a opposites attract sort of thing. But he, as an ISTJ, as a child, you can see that extroverted intuition part of him coming out. Like, he's like super into everything that screams of adventure and new lands and exploring the world. And he was so fascinated by it, he ended up falling in love with a woman who also represented all of that, but in a less childlike way, in more of like, this is what adventure looks like in a day-to-day reality. This is what a human that represents exploration looks like in day-to-day reality, and he fell in love with her. And then when she was gone and when he was able to sort of pull his resources and was beyond the time period that culture reinforced that he not be that kind of person, right? Then he had his big adventure. And I think that that's always living inside of an ISJ. That part of them, that compulsion to have adventure and to see something bigger, is always living inside, which is why when their stressors get them to shut off their dominant and they go to that inferior, sometimes they can make extraordinarily radical changes that just everybody in their life just twirls their head. They're like, what? They did what? What? That's not like them. And it is like them. It is the part of them. It is tapping on their shoulder and whispering in their ear. It's just they're really good at ignoring that part of who they are. Now, of course, that's when we see the joie de vivre come out. But I think the compulsion that lives in the inferior and tertiary, or 3-year-old and 10-year-old for this function, is more often seen in when it can't be funneled or sort of focused on something healthier. It oftentimes looks like catastrophizing, because extroverted intuition is also that part that tries to create patterns out of what it's seeing and goes, okay, so how what can I expect out of this? Right? It's not a general sense of paranoia like introverted intuition or perspectives can show up as. SPs oftentimes have a sense of paranoia, and it's just like this feeling like something all is going to go wrong. It's more like building cases for a catastrophe. Like, well, if this happens and this happens, then this is what's going to result from it. And it's an attempt to pattern recognize the worst case scenario, when really that function is meant to be used as the best case scenario. It's meant to be used for optimism. So when it's a compulsion, but the person is pushing it away, oftentimes it looks like constantly catastrophizing or seeing the worst case scenario. When it's used in a healthy way, though, it's designed to make connections about how things are actually working out the way they should be working out, and how there are connections that are happening outside, like emergence of systems running that you can never predict, but actually turned out the way that they were supposed to.
I think you see this also in like conspiracy theory. I think extrovert intuition, both intuitive processes in the backseat, can be conspiratorially focused, but it seems to be extroverted intuition is more of the two. Like you said, there's that sense of foreboding for introverted intuition, but extroverted intuition, it's like, oh no, they're making connections, right? This means this, and these cloud formations are like from jet planes that are, the government's doing this to us here, and that's connected to this over here at Area 51, and that means the Illuminati's, and the ... keeps going, right? Not saying any of that's true or not true. I'm just saying that's where I think that comes from. A lot of people that have extroverted intuition in the back seat tend to have those kind of things focused in their minds. And I think it's that compulsion. They're looking for connections and trying to make connections of dots that may or may not be there. So I think that comes up for them a lot.
Well, I think when conspiracy theories come up for people who are using introverted intuition, it's oftentimes trying to create meaning from the things they're experiencing or seeing. You know, like you talk about those, the vapor trails.
That's the word I was looking for.
Right. Yeah, the vapor trails and what that means, right? They're seeing the vapor trails and they're trying to figure out the meaning and implication behind it. But I do think that people who use extroverted intuition as a tertiary and inferior 10-year-old, 3-year-old, I think they very much can create like some pretty stellar stories about what's going on, right? And what's happening. And it's more about putting two and two together. I think the people who tend to be the most conspiratorial or see conspiracies the most are the ones who have who are thinkers with some form of intuition, either like basically anywhere. It's like the thinkers that are intuitive, like INTJs, INTPs, ESTJs, ISTPs, the thinking dominants with intuition as a tertiary 10-year-old. That's very common. And so yeah, but I think the flavor changes of the styles of conspiracy theory depending upon which intuition they're using.
If you look at extroverted intuition higher up in the stack, you know, driver, co-pilot, dominant, auxiliary, You're going to see a compulsion to change things up. Remember, these come in polarities, right? So introverted sensing, if it's tracking etymology, it's tracking structure, it's tracking what has come before, almost like infrastructure. Extrovert intuition looks at that and goes, well, how can we change this? What can we alter here? What compulsion do I have, or not what compulsion do I have? I have a compulsion to want to change things. Like I look at the public education system here in the United States, secondary school, actually college, university too. I think it's a disaster of a system. We've got good teachers and eager students and a system that doesn't allow those two entities to connect and have real learning happen as the emergent. So I look at that and go, the structure, the system's the problem. Teachers aren't the problem. They've got good hearts, good intentions. Students, every kid wants to learn. They want to know stuff. They want to be better. Like that's what we do as kids. Obviously, the system is corrupt. The system's broken. The system's messed up. So let's burn the whole thing to the ground. I have this compulsion to want to change it, right? Let's burn it to the ground. Let's change the system. I almost can't help feel that way. And I have to remember, okay, that compulsion could do damage if I didn't rein it in and have some focus around it, right? We don't want to just literally destroy something without something to replace it. That'll create a vacuum in the world. So I think that's an example of maybe how this would show up at the dominant or auxiliary position in these compulsions to want to change structure so badly. And you almost can't help yourself but want to change those things about the world.
Yeah, well, we see it in our business, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like in our business, profiler training has gone through many iterations, how we change the structure of it. The content's still the same. We're the same. Even the learning is the same. The outcome is the same. But the way we go about it has changed over time. Over the last 7 years, we keep tweaking the structure. And in some ways, I'm always fiddling with the structures of the business underneath everything. Like the content's very similar or the same. It's how we deliver it that I'm always trying to find ways to change it up. It's almost like I can't help myself. I'm compelled to change how we do what we do and try to do it better.
Yeah, and I think you and I have actually learned a lesson that maybe we need to stop changing it so often.
Or slowly change it over time, or stages of change rather than wholesale. Like, oh, we're going to do this now, completely over this way.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think no matter, again, all NPs and SJs have a compulsion to use this. It's just how often we're doing it. And as a dominant, I think we are better at knowing that concept of discretion, knowing when we should be using it. We've taken a lot of territory with it, how often. We get that real world feedback that we're changing too much for other people's comfort, not for ours, but for other people's comfort, and then we throttle. And I think that idea of how much you can change, though, I think we've gotten away with a lot and made much better products and programs because of it, because we know that we can get away with making changes, and we'll use our extroverted intuition or exploration as part of how we get people excited about some of those changes. So sometimes it's too much and we get that feedback and we go, okay, we got to throttle it, but we're still making changes. We're just doing it in a little bit more of a user experience friendly way. And so again, the higher up something is in your stack, the more you're going to refine it and be better at it. But even as an inferior function for ISJs, there's still that piece that wants that change. And it's a matter of integrating it. And I think the world is actually making it a little friendlier to ISJs to integrate that part of who they are. And when I say friendly, I don't mean the process is friendly. The process is probably grueling. Anytime we're forced to integrate our inferior or 3-year-old, that's a grueling process. But the world is set up to encourage it now, which I think is actually quite healthy for ISJs.
So in kind of coming down to the end of this episode, we have talked about how in the past episode and this episode, how we have these functions in our stack or our car model. They are parts of us. We are compelled to use, regardless of where they fall. We talked a little bit about the ways they might show up depending on the position they are in your car, your cognitive function stack. But I want to hear from you. What has been coming up for you in these two discussions? Where have you seen this show up in your life? You know, you've heard some of our personal examples or our observations of the people we've worked with, clients, people we've worked with in our lives, friends, family. But you have your own individual story of how this shows up for you. We want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Directly below this episode, you can leave your story, ask your question, give your feedback, make your voice heard as part of the community here of Personality Hacker.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating review for us on iTunes, that's super duper helpful because I believe that that's their algorithm for kicking us up in their charts. So if you like us and you review us and rate us positively, actually even negatively, I think, it doesn't matter if we get...
Stop saying that.
So don't review us negatively, but I'm saying that their algorithm... I'm just speaking truth. Their algorithm is that if people give us a lot of ratings and reviews, no matter what it looks like, they're going to kick us up more in the charts. And if you give us a positive one, then it lets future listeners know that this is a good podcast to listen to. So give us a good rating and review if you feel motivated to, because that helps us out a lot. And also our book. That's the other thing I'm supposed to say, right? Our book is out, Personality Hacker. Go check it out at all major retailers and at Amazon and Books A Million, etc. And if you leave us a rating and review for the book on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot.
My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.